There's a saying here in Minnesota, Minnesota nice. And that Minnesota nice only goes so far. And Heidi Firkus, she went all the way. She was genuine, and she loved deep.
She definitely lived a life of love. That was the mark that she left. And that's hard to let go.
This is a terrible, terrible incident. We're hoping to find other physical evidence that might help us, lead us in a direction toward a suspect.
The morning of April 25th, 2010, at 6:30 a.m., Heidi Firkus calls 911.
Someone's trying to break into my home.
She tells the State Patrol dispatcher that someone is trying to break into her house, and she's trying to give her address.
1794 Minnehaha Avenue.
While she's on the phone, you can hear a loud noise, and the phone goes dead.
Well, I don't know where she went there.
Approximately a minute later, Nicholas Firkus calls 911, says that he and his wife have both been shot.
Okay, are you in St. Paul, sir?
St. Paul fire paramedics took Nick out to the ambulance and transported him to Regions Hospital. He had been shot in the leg. Heidi was struck in the back as she was trying to flee towards the kitchen. It was a shotgun blast that killed her right away. The shotgun was laying inside the front door area. There's a little foyer. Nick gave a brief story. He heard somebody fiddling around with the door, and that he then armed himself with a shotgun, and that Nick and the intruder struggled over the shotgun. The responding officers went up and down the block, tried to talk to neighbors.
I was next door house sitting when the crime happened. Really all I heard was kind of this agonizing yell of, "You shot her, you shot me."
It never felt right. The story never made sense to me. He tells investigators that he grabbed a shotgun, loaded it with 2 shells, and then proceeded to have Heidi go down the stairs in front of him towards the very door that this alleged burglar was at. Why you would send the unarmed person down in front of you is beyond me. To me, there were only 2 people in that house when Heidi was killed.
And they were?
Nick and Heidi.
In order to believe that Nick killed Heidi, you have to believe that a good man with no history of violence killed the woman that he loved more than anything in life for no reason. That's what you have to believe. We can't get there.
Well, this area of St. Paul, where Heidi and Nick Firkus lived, I would characterize as generally a quiet neighborhood.
Back in 2010, 9 years before she took charge of the Firkus case, Detective Nicole Sipes of the St. Paul Police Department was a patrol cop who worked this neighborhood.
Do you remember first hearing about the Firkus case?
I do.
Okay, are you?
It was early on a Sunday morning.
The 911 call was at 6:30.
Nick Firkus's story of a burglar didn't make sense to Sipes.
Most people are home at 6:30 on a Sunday morning, especially in a family neighborhood like that. The last thing that most burglars want to encounter are people.
Did police ever have any luck tracking down the intruder that Nick described?
No.
I'm looking, I didn't see anybody come out of that house.
Brandon O'Connor was house sitting next door to the Firkuses and taking care of kittens.
I was woken up by the kittens, kind of walking around. Some noise caught my attention, so stuck my head out the window, kind of listen.
Brandon says he recalls hearing a muffled argument coming from the Firkuses' house, listening through an open window.
That's when I ended up hearing what sounded like gunshots.
Around this time, Brandon said he also heard that voice crying out.
Kind of this agonizing yell of, "You shot her, you shot me, please, please, no," something along those lines, and then it was done.
First responders rushed to the scene. There was nothing they could do for Heidi. She was pronounced dead. Nick was rushed to the hospital and treated for a grazed gunshot wound to his leg. He seemed not to be sure whether or not Heidi had been killed.
Like I said, we'll do our best to find out how Heidi's doing, please.
Hours later, Nick was transported to the St. Paul Police Department.
Then Nick and I started to have our conversation in the conference room.
Sergeant Jim Gray took Nick's statement.
You know, I know this is a very traumatic situation, okay? And I'm just gonna try and ease into it, okay? So
Nick said the couple ordered in food the night before and watched the movie Avatar. They went upstairs to their bedroom around 11 p.m. The next morning, Nick got up around 6 a.m. to get a drink of water from the bathroom.
Go back to sleep, but just kind of fitfully sleep for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I heard the screen door open. Kind of let it go for a little while, but then I started feeling with our doorknob.
And is Heidi still sleeping then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like a rock.
Nick said he retrieved his shotgun from the closet.
I keep 2 shells for it just in case things go weird. So when I heard things this morning, I did load it. And then I wake up Heidi.
Okay.
According to Nick, he told Heidi someone was trying to break in and to call 911. As she spoke with the dispatcher,
Someone's trying to break into my house.
they headed downstairs so they could get out of the house.
What address are you at?
All right. So you going first down the stairs, or is she behind you, or is she in front of you, or what?
She's in front because I'm kind of trying to move her along quickly.
Yeah.
Nick said as they passed by the front door, it burst open.
Guy that was there, I think he grabbed the barrel. I don't remember exactly what happened, but the gun went off. So my fingers slipped onto the trigger.
Nick told Sergeant Gray during the struggle over the weapon, the gun fired, striking Heidi, who he said was in the kitchen.
Okay, so the
Gun's here,
Yep.
chest high.
Yep. You and I are like this.
Yeah.
And then the gun goes off.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know it hit Heidi. I know it did. She was running away, so he definitely hit her in the back.
Hit her in the back.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it.
Can't be true. There's no way.
Katina and Marcus Sarazin mentored Heidi at Calvary Church.
I think she's one of those people that you can't not like. Everyone liked Heidi.
She genuinely loved people. She was the life of the party, always finding fun ways to engage people, and she was very loyal.
The couple met at the church. And in 2005, Heidi, 20, and Nick, 22, got married.
Nick Firkus had a very warm and engaging personality, always smiling. He carried himself with confidence, and he had high character, high integrity in the church. That was the reputation he'd built for himself.
But just a few hours after Heidi's death, Sergeant Jim Gray found himself questioning Nick Firkus's account. He couldn't figure out why the couple would leave the safety of their bedroom.
You come upstairs, I hate to tell you this, but my house, I'm justified in killing you if you come breaking in my house.
Yeah, and I guess
Nick explained that the couple had a plan in place. If they were ever in a precarious situation, they would avoid a confrontation and escape to their car in the garage and get away.
If we can save ourselves, let's do that instead of getting into a situation where...
His story didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Sergeant Gray started probing into their marriage.
You guys have any problems or anything like that?
It's just the normal stuff, like, stresses about finances and quality time and vacations and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But
you guys aren't behind in the bills or anything?
We are behind in the bills, which is a little stressful. In fact, we were planning on moving tomorrow.
Moving where?
Well, we hadn't figured that out yet. We were, and this is a hard place for us. We foreclosed on our house.
Nick revealed they were behind on their mortgage payments and just 24 hours away from being evicted from their home.
Well, that's kind of close notice.
It is, and I think the reason is because we're both kind of dealing with the shape of the whole thing.
Gray says his suspicions were raised, and minutes later, he was struck by the way Nick asked about Heidi.
Well, I just want to know the final answer on Heidi.
She didn't make it.
I figured that. I mean,
Is that typically how someone asks if their loved one or spouse has been killed?
Not only is that not typical that that's how they'd ask it, but they wouldn't wait an hour and 40 minutes into this conversation to ask that question. And I've watched the interview, obviously, numerous times, and I understand people react to trauma differently. But this was different than what I'd seen. Anybody that's watched that interview cannot help but be struck by Nick's demeanor during it.
And that demeanor was?
This was just another day. This was something he had to get through.
Skeptical of Nick's story, Sergeant Gray confronted Nick about what happened that day.
Nick, part of me wants to ask you this question. Did you have anything to do with this?
no, absolutely not.
Okay,
Absolutely not.
all right.
Why is there a party that wants to ask that?
Well, Nick, I'm a police officer, okay?
Yeah.
I gotta ask the tough questions, all right?
After the interview, Nick left the police station. That day, investigators returned to the Firkus home with a search warrant. Gray says it did not look like anyone was planning to move out the next day.
Nothing was packaged up at all. The closet was still full of clothes. We noticed that there was still food in the refrigerator.
And there was something else that investigators questioned.
We didn't see any signs of forced entry into the house. Based off of the physical evidence at the scene, his version of the incident couldn't be plausible.
What do you think of Nick's story about the intruder? Chat now on Facebook and X.
48 hours after Nick Firkus said an intruder shot and killed his wife Heidi, police went back to the crime scene to check out his story.
He told us that there was a life and death struggle inside the house.
But Sergeant Gray says the evidence at the crime scene didn't match Nick's account.
There was a vase, some receipts, a beer bottle, and none of that was knocked over. So that kind of raised suspicion to us that if there was such a struggle, why wasn't any of this stuff knocked over?
Sergeant Gray says he examined the front door for signs of a break-in and did notice some markings.
But it wasn't anything new that would lead us to believe that the door had been forced open the day of the murder.
In his interview, Nick said he heard someone fiddling with the front door from upstairs.
Like, what are they doing? Are they just going like this?
Yeah.
Kind of like that?
Yeah, just shaking the knob and
Okay.
shutting the door.
That day, Sergeant Gray and his colleagues did a
6:16 in the
reenactment
morning, April 27th, 2010.
to determine if they could hear the front door shaking from the bedroom.
We're in the bedroom looking.
Sergeant Shackle and Sergeant Wright were upstairs in the bedroom.
I'm at the front door, so let me know when you guys are ready. I'll try the knob for 15 seconds then.
We are ready.
They could not hear me fiddling with the door.
All right.
Sergeant Gray says he also doubted Nick's story about the couple's eviction and a scheduled move the day after Heidi was shot.
There didn't appear to be anything boxed up or packaged up to go. There were a few empty boxes in the dining room area. There was not a grand stack of boxes or anything for that matter that would lead us to believe that they were going to pack up all in one day.
Meanwhile, Heidi's mentors from Calvary Church, Marcus and Katina, were learning the details about her death and the eviction.
It just didn't add up. Something wasn't right with that story.
It seemed so out of the ordinary that she would be moving and not have notified anyone, not have anything prepared for that, because she planned things out and she liked things to be orderly.
On April 30th, 2010, 5 days after her passing, Marcus and Katina attended Heidi's funeral.
Yeah, the atmosphere at the funeral there was a lot of emotion.
At the funeral, Marcus and Katina say they were struck by Nick's demeanor.
I remember going through the receiving line and shaking his hand. There was no grief showing.
It just felt like he lacked emotion.
Marcus says he went as far as asking some of the couple's friends if Nick could have shot his wife.
And the answer I got was, no, there's no way that Nick killed Heidi. He loved her. There's just no way he could have done that. And I just wasn't so sure about that.
From what we gathered during our investigation, Nick and Heidi were in a loving relationship. There was no problems or issues that anybody saw.
Your first impression upon meeting Nick Firkus is no way in the world could he have committed a violent act.
The day after the shooting, Nick's family hired attorney Joe Friedberg, who advised Nick to stop talking to the police.
It didn't take long to realize that he was being looked at as a suspect.
When investigators asked Nick to sit down with their artist to draw a sketch of the intruder, Friedberg advised him not to.
They were going to use it as an opportunity to further interview him.
Instead, Nick and his attorney hired their own sketch artist.
It was quite odd that Nick would work with a private sketch artist.
And brought that drawing to police.
And at that point, we were basically told that Nick would not be answering any more questions with regards to our investigation.
Investigators released Nick's sketch to the public, but it didn't generate any leads. They kept working the case. Nick moved out of their home a few weeks after Heidi's death. 2 months later, he began a friendship with the sister of one of Heidi's best friends, Rachel Sanchez, who is going through a divorce.
At the time, I thought because we shared something traumatic, there was a deep connection there. Because I had come out of something traumatic myself in a relationship, I think Nick seemed to be handling things well. It felt like he was very grounded. He was with his friends a lot, and they were processing together. So I think just his steadiness was an attractive quality.
Rachel says the two bonded over their faith. They began dating in the spring of 2011.
At the time, God played a big part in my life, and I think that's another quality that I saw in him, that he loved God like I did.
1 year into their relationship, Nick proposed.
I knew it was coming. We had looked at rings beforehand, so it wasn't really a huge surprise.
And a few months later, the couple married. They started a family.
We did have kids pretty quickly.
And soon were the parents of 3 children.
He absolutely loves his kids so much.
Andrew and Emily Erickson are friends of Nick. They say for a long time, Nick didn't talk much about Heidi's murder.
Yeah, it just didn't seem like there was a lot of room for his grief during that time.
But they say when he did talk about it, his story was always the same.
What did he tell you? Same thing he's always told everyone from the first day, same thing he'd tell you today, that someone was breaking into the house and they were going to try to get out, and there was an altercation, and tragically Heidi was killed.
Investigators still did not believe that story. But 5 years after Heidi's death, with little movement in the case, they finally got a break. Someone called in a tip.
There was somebody that looked exactly like the sketch.
And put a name to Nick's sketch.
Somebody called, said, I have an experience with this guy. I think I know who it is.
After 5 years without a break in Heidi Firkus's murder case, out of the blue, a tipster called police with a name after seeing this sketch of the suspect. But there was a problem, says investigator Sipes.
He was already in prison on the date of Heidi's death.
Nick's second wife, Rachel, says her husband rarely talked about the case being solved.
But I had asked him, are you going to put effort into seeing if you can find the person that did this? He didn't reach out to anyone as far as I know. I know that from his lawyers, he was told to just stay silent.
Police found it odd Nick never checked in.
Through 4 investigators, in this case, he never contacted one of us to ask the status.
Was this case ever considered a cold case?
It wasn't ever considered a cold case because
Prosecutors Rachel Crocker and Elizabeth Lawman joined the investigation in 2015.
there just was not a lot of new information coming in.
Heidi's family would check in on her birthday. Is there anything new development?
And there would be new developments when Detective Sipes took over Heidi's case in 2019.
Seems her fresh set of eyes really made a huge difference.
It was absolutely critical.
I think Sipes definitely restarted something.
Sipes dug deep, reviewing the entire case file, including an examination of a financial timeline she compiled with the help of the FBI.
I had the luxury of looking back on all of these things several years later.
Sipes learned Nick worked at his family's carpet installation business. They were contractors for Home Depot. Heidi was a clerk at a financial services company in St. Paul. Their combined income was about $70,000 a year.
They seemed like they were on top of all the bills before they bought the house.
But Lawman says the home purchase in 2007 strained the couple's finances.
And that home was just too much for them.
By the time Heidi died in April of 2010, the couple was deeply in debt.
He had not paid the mortgage in 22 months.
In fact, the couple had lost their home to foreclosure and would be forced to move out. But Sipes discovered Heidi apparently had no idea. After reviewing the couple's texts and emails, Sipes saw no evidence Nick ever told Heidi they were in financial trouble.
There was no communication between the two of them to indicate that she had any idea the depth of their financial issues. I was able to determine through the foreclosure and eviction attorneys that there was no paperwork Heidi had signed, that nobody had ever talked to Heidi, nobody met Heidi. Heidi didn't go to the eviction hearing on March 8th, 2010.
Sipes says Nick and Heidi's family and friends didn't know the couple had to relocate.
And if she was serious about moving, she would have gotten the day off.
So she was planning to go to work?
Yes.
Why do you think he kept her in the dark so long?
Shame. I believe he was concerned about the shame of what he had done, how it would look, that he couldn't come clean with her. You know, it had gotten too big at that point.
And when Sipes talked to the couple's friends, she learned why Nick wanted to hide their financial situation.
He was described by his friends as being wise and being the person that they would go to for advice.
Nick Firkus really presented as somebody who had some of those bigger, tougher life questions figured out. What kind of person do you want to be? What kind of relationship do you want to have with God?
What does that tell you as you're investigating the case and you see someone in that type of personality?
It just became easier to see that this was someone who did not want his friends, his family, to know the extent to which he had failed.
Sipes says she discovered more of Nick's lies when she learned about a conversation Heidi had with a friend just the day before she died.
Heidi had talked to us about how Nick had told her that they were victims of identity theft. It was somewhere around $180,000 to $200,000 worth of identity theft. Wasn't true. They weren't the victims. This was all untrue.
But as Sipes tried to figure out if there was a connection between Nick's lies and Heidi's death, she learned Nick and Rachel had divorced.
I remember very well when Nikki Sipes came to my door.
And that Nick had also kept secrets from her.
Did Rachel ever say anything about why their marriage dissolved?
She did. There were financial issues between the two of them. Nick was lying about a lot of things.
This is a story that's happened before and it didn't end well. That terrified me.
Could there actually have been an intruder?
After spending 19 months digging deep into the Firkus case file, reviewing crime scene photos, 911 calls,
Do you remember what he was wearing?
and Nick's video interview,
She was running away, so he definitely hit her in the back.
investigator Nicole Sipes had come to one conclusion.
What really matters is what happened in that foyer. And there was no third person.
You never found anyone else's DNA?
No. No DNA evidence, no physical evidence, no sign of a struggle. To me, there were only two people in that house when Heidi was killed.
And they were?
Nick and Heidi.
As part of the new investigation, Sipes reached out to Nick's second wife, Rachel. What did she know?
In 2020, she came to my door and I was like, "Why are you here?" And she was like, "To talk about Heidi Firkus."
At first, Rachel, then divorced from Nick, says she was reluctant to talk.
You're asking for a lot when you get involved in something like this. And I didn't want to, but I also knew that it was the right thing to do and it was for truth.
Rachel told Sipes Nick had lied about their finances during their marriage.
I found a letter saying that we hadn't paid our property taxes and that we were going to get evicted in 2020 if we didn't pay them. And when I saw that, I was like, oh no, like he was definitely repeating the same things as he did with Heidi with me.
During that time, Rachel says Nick's dishonesty started to make her question whether he had also lied about Heidi's death.
And I said, we got to sit down and talk.
Rachel secretly recorded the conversation on her phone.
Your actions have caused me to just distrust you completely.
If there was going to be a confession, I was going to make sure that I could prove that he said it.
And the fact that you're lying was so easy for you to do in front of me over and over and over makes me think
That I could murder my wife.
that you could lie about something.
That I could murder my wife.
Yes.
When I listen, I think this silence kills me. He's angry at me. How dare I think those things? Why aren't you saying you didn't? Tell me I'm not right.
Rachel later shared the recordings with investigator Sipes.
The behavior that he exhibited in his marriage with Rachel was almost duplicative of how he hid things from Heidi.
We cannot let this man be out on the street any longer.
For prosecutor Elizabeth Lawman, the time had come to act.
I told Sergeant Sipes, we're charging him. Let's do it.
11 years after Heidi was shot to death, on May 19, 2021, a St. Paul police SWAT team arrested Nick Firkus at his house and charged him with second-degree murder. A grand jury ultimately indicted Firkus on first- and second-degree murder charges.
Our minds were absolutely blown.
Heidi's friends, Marcus and Katina, were relieved.
It's hard to say. I don't know what emotion you even put to it. It's hard to say excited.
Yeah, I felt grateful. We don't understand.
Nick's friends, Emily and Andrew.
You have to believe that a good man with no history of violence killed the woman that he loved more than anything in life for no reason. That's what you have to believe. We can't get there.
After remaining free on bail for almost 2 years, on January 27, 2023, Nick Firkus went on trial. Prosecutors would not be allowed to call Nick's second wife, Rachel, to testify or use her taped conversation with Nick. The judge ruled her testimony and the recording had no bearing on the case.
I went into it with an open mind.
Natalie Michael served on the jury.
Did he appear like a man who would kill his wife?
No, he did not. A lot through the trial, he was putting his head down. When they showed the photos of the two of them together, you know, he seemed like he really was in love with her.
I think Nick was someone who lived two lives.
Prosecutors presented an unusual motive. They told the jurors Nick Firkus staged a burglary because he was desperate and ashamed. His secrets were about to be revealed to Heidi and everyone else.
all of his kind of cards of lies are about to crumble. He would have been exposed as a complete failure, a liar to his friends and community, and instead, he's a victim. He walks away from this supported by his friends, supported by his family.
Nick had no reason.
Nick's lawyers, Joe Friedberg and Robert Richmond, say that simply makes no sense as a motive.
There was nothing about murdering the woman who everyone agreed he loved that would help his situation.
And they say the state's contention that Heidi didn't know about the couple's finances simply was not true.
Nick said she was in on all of the major decisions. He would say to us that they're making Heidi out to be an imbecile.
At first, I was wondering how she couldn't know about the finances or some of the foreclosure, some of the things happening.
But Natalie Michael says the prosecution's case did not hinge on motive.
The prosecution said it really is, was there an intruder in the house or was there not an intruder?
It was our position that there had been an intruder, exactly the way Nick described to the police on the 911 call, at the scene.
The information that Nick gave at the scene is that this intruder came into the house.
At the hospital.
He just came in.
And to Sergeant Gray.
Guy that was there, I think he grabbed the barrel.
Nick's lawyers say police didn't find the intruder's fingerprints or DNA at the scene because, as Nick told investigators in his interview at the hospital,
And what else can you describe from him?
the intruder was wearing gloves.
Gloves. He's wearing gloves.
You don't always leave DNA, and especially when your hands are covered.
So what am I looking at here?
But prosecutors say there was something else missing from the scene besides fingerprints.
This is a physical model to scale that was created by the FBI.
They used this model to show the jurors there was no evidence of a struggle.
I felt that it was very important for us to be able to recreate how small that entryway is.
Let's say the intruder gets in, they have this struggle.
And they have this life and death struggle right in this area with nothing disturbed.
On the table.
Exactly. And then Heidi gets shot square in the back in a very clear shot.
This animation, created by the FBI, shows that the bullet that killed Heidi was most likely shot from shoulder level.
The height at which Heidi is shot fits exactly on Nick's shoulder to aim and to fire.
Nick's attorneys say there was direct evidence that showed there was an intruder.
In fact, there were tool marks in the door, which would be consistent with someone wedging a screwdriver between the frame and the door.
Attorney Joe Friedberg says Firkus's next-door neighbor, Brandon O'Connor, testified he heard a voice.
You shot her, you shot me, please, please, no, something along those lines.
That means there must have been another person in that house. Nick was talking to a third person when he said that.
But prosecutors say Brandon may have misheard Nick while he was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher.
He is screaming about being shot, and he did that over almost 7 minutes.
Stay on the phone with me, okay?
Nick Firkus did not take the stand. After an 11-day trial, the case went to the jury.
If there's anything in this case, there's reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
See more evidence from the case at 48hours.com.
It was a hard-fought, litigated trial.
As the state and Nick Firkus's defense team presented their closing arguments on February 10th, 2023,
we had great, we thought, circumstantial evidence that what Nick said happened did not happen.
attorneys on both sides were hopeful the jury would make the right decision.
It's not enough if you have a hunch. There was no direct evidence that Nick murdered his wife.
In her closing argument, Prosecutor Crocker said Firkus shot Heidi while she was on the phone with the 911 operator.
Someone's trying west.
So that call does end with a very, very loud noise, and the call goes dead. And we believe that that's the gunshot.
According to phone records, 65 seconds passed from that moment until Firkus made his 911 call. Crocker reenacted for jurors what she believed Nick Firkus did before he made that call.
I walked over in the courtroom to roughly as far as Heidi would have been on the ground, crouched down, turned her over to check for a pulse to be sure that she was in fact deceased. Walked back over, picked up the firearm, and demonstrated how he could shoot himself and call 911.
Where is the guy that shot you?
At 65 seconds, there was more than enough time for all of that to happen.
To prove their theory Firkus shot himself in the thigh, they point to marks left by shotgun pellets at the bottom of the front door.
When he shot himself, we believe that Nick was about here. Just how you would brace yourself, probably against the door if you're doing it to yourself.
Of his reasonable suspicion.
But Firkus's attorneys challenged the 65-second time frame. Attorney Robert Richmond says phone records also show Firkus misdialed 2 numbers before getting through to 911, making it impossible to shoot himself.
What they reenacted was 65 seconds, which was ignoring the 2 misdials, which happened at 38 seconds. The fact that we cannot find the intruder is not evidence that there was no intruder. And if anything, because of the next door neighbor, because of the tool marks, because of the 38 seconds, we feel that the evidence supports that there was an intruder.
This isn't blind belief.
Nick's friends Emily and Andrew were convinced the prosecution failed to prove Firkus was the shooter.
We were open to hearing an inconsistency of what Nick said, but that didn't happen.
On February 10th, 2023, the jurors got the case and in 5 hours returned with a verdict.
My last text to Nick was, it has to be innocent. There's no way that they got to guilty this quickly. We rushed to the courthouse and we were so wrong.
Nick Firkus was found guilty on 2 counts of murder, premeditated and intentional.
I believe justice was served.
Marcus and Katina were in the courtroom when the verdict was read.
Justice may have been slow, but fortunately, the jury got it right. It feels like this is the beginning of healing. It's the beginning of a new chapter.
Heidi's mom actually said that for so many years, they had to live with Nick Firkus's narrative, and they knew it was wrong, but they just didn't have another narrative. And to finally be able to have him finally held accountable, it meant a lot to us.
For Sergeant Sipes, there is still the mystery of what led to the couple's financial problems.
We weren't able to definitively say what the money was spent on.
Does that frustrate you?
Greatly. I think it would help complete the picture for some people.
On April 13th, 2023, Nick Firkus was back in court for a sentencing hearing and to hear victim impact statements.
Growing up, Heidi was the quintessential little sister to me.
Heidi's brother, Peter Erickson.
Because of the lies we were told as early as the day after her murder, it's been virtually impossible to find closure to our grief.
Firkus refused to admit guilt.
I do maintain and will maintain to my dying breath my innocence of this crime. My body stands condemned to serve another man's sentence. But my soul remains free.
Judge Leonardo Castro imposed the maximum sentence.
It is the sentence of law and judgment of this court that you be committed to the Commission of Corrections for the remainder of your life without the possibility of release. Good luck to you, sir. Godspeed.
My kids are always what I think of first.
Firkus's second wife, Rachel.
They lost in this too, because one day they had a dad that they thought was somebody, and the next day he's not that person anymore.
She often thinks about Heidi too.
I like to think I have a connection with Heidi. She didn't get to have the voice that I have now, and so I can only hope that my voice is something she would be proud of.
Heidi was a genuine, loving, sincere young woman who wanted to live life to the fullest. She wouldn't want people to become bitter or angry because of what she had to experience. I think that Heidi would want people to choose to love, regardless of circumstances.
CBS next Saturday. 48 Hours brings you back-to-back episodes all summer long. Next week, social media clues.
Johnny Altinger would answer a dating ad and disappear.
She would track his location.
48 Hours primetime double feature. Next Saturday on CBS, streaming on Paramount+.
I'm Anne-Marie Green, and we are back for another episode of 48 Hours Post-mortem. Today, we're here with CBS News correspondent Jamie Yuccas and producers Asena, Basak, and Jordan Kinsey, who worked on this week's episode. It's called Death at the Front Door. Who Shot Heidi Firkus? Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So, Jamie, first off, you were actually from Minnesota. This case took place in St. Paul. What was it like covering a case in your hometown?
Well, you know, it's one of those things. It is always a little strange to be back home covering something, especially something like this, a murder that you watched for years not be solved. At the time that this murder took place, I was living in Fort Myers, Florida, which we jokingly call Minnesota South. It's where all the snowbirds in Minnesota head. And I frequently talk to one of my best friends from college lived in St. Paul. My brother lives in St. Paul. It was one of those that when we heard about it, it's a neighborhood that's very residential, very quiet, very nice. I mean, you know, there's parks nearby, big trees, old porches. So it was one of those things that was very strange to hear. Maybe you'd hear about a break-in, something like that, but nothing like a murder. And then several years later, I went back and I worked in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market. And every year we would do the update of, you know, now a sketch is being posted of a potential suspect or the yearly update, and nothing ever came of it. So now to see, you know, living in Los Angeles, to see this all come to fruition. I mean, I've had like 4 lifetimes since this case took place. It's something else. I mean, just to see it actually conclude, I think is shocking. And I think the way it concluded is even more surprising to people who are from that area.
Right. So, and Jordan, you're not from Minnesota, but you went back there. You know, you've gone back there quite a lot now. I don't know if you feel like you're from Minnesota because you've been back so often, but what was it like for you?
Yeah. At this point, I feel like I'm a Minnesotan Viking for sure. But yes, I was flying back and forth to and from Minnesota several times this year. And what viewers may not realize is how much the culture of Minnesota plays and influences this case.
Yeah, you know, Jamie was talking about that a little bit earlier when we were talking about this case about Minnesota nice. And yep. I said, I kind of understand because I'm Canadian and Canadians have this reputation of being quite nice.
Yeah, it's one of those things, you know, you'll always open the door for people. You'll, you know, chit chat about the weather in the elevator, but you don't ask deep questions. So while it's nice, it's not direct and you're not asking tough questions of people.
Mm-hmm. And all of that kind of plays into this case, which we will get into. So before we get to our postmortem, let's listen to an overview of this week's episode.
Someone's trying to break into my home.
Heidi Firkus's 911 call went dead after a loud noise. About a minute later, her husband Nick Firkus called 911. Firkus was treated for a grazed gunshot wound to his leg. There was nothing the first responders could do for Heidi. Sergeant Jim Gray of St. Paul Police Department.
It was a shotgun blast that killed her right away.
Firkus told police he heard someone fiddling with the front doorknob from upstairs.
He then armed himself with a shotgun.
Nick says as the couple tried to escape out the back, the front door burst open.
And Nick and the intruder struggled over the shotgun.
After Firkus was treated at the hospital, he gave a statement to Sergeant Gray at the police station.
I think he grabbed the barrel.
Let's say the intruder gets in.
Prosecutor Elizabeth Lawman.
They have this life and death struggle right in this area with nothing disturbed.
On the table.
Exactly.
There was a vase, some receipts, a beer bottle, and none of that was knocked over. His story didn't make a lot of sense to me. His version of the incident couldn't be plausible.
So to start, I want to discuss the very first moment of this case. It's the morning of April 25th. It's 2010. Nick alleged that he heard a noise at their front door and he believes that someone's really trying to break into their home. So Heidi first called 911 and then a minute later, Nick called back saying that both he and his wife had been shot. Here's a never before heard segment that was not included in the hour.
Someone's trying to break into my home.
Prosecutors also said that no sound of a struggle could be heard on Heidi's 911 call.
When Nick called 911 after Heidi had been shot, you could hear a lot of background noise when the police arrived.
The police are there? Okay.
You can hear the police come in. You can hear them talking to him from the front door.
In Heidi's call, Lawman says there is no indication of Nick struggling with an intruder in the background.
1794, Minnehaha Avenue.
Up to the moment the gun goes off.
Somebody's trying to break in our house.
Okay, so they both sound panicked. When there's an incident happening, more than one person often calls 911. So what seemed inconsistent to investigators about this story?
Well, there were a number of flags that popped up pretty quickly. First of all, Nick Firkus said that he had heard this intruder jiggling with the door lock from upstairs while he was getting a glass of water. Heidi was sleeping. He hears this happen. According to investigators, he goes back into his room, is what he claimed to them, and gets his gun, wakes up Heidi, and has her go down the stairs first. Now, most investigators started immediately questioning the story of that because why, in their minds, would someone send their wife in front of them when they're the ones who have the gun? And why would you leave the comfort of your bedroom if you know that you have a firearm? The other thing that you heard a little bit on that call is that Heidi says some things where she's talking about just herself. It doesn't sound like she is actually with Nick Firkus. Why would she be talking about herself in the first person and not about the two of them as a couple trying to get out? She sounds very hurried. They had a staircase they were trying to get down. So I think that's where you hear kind of a little bit of the, the angst and trying to get down the stairs. But again, investigators wondered, were they together?
But, when you listen to Heidi, when you listen to her voice on the 911 recording, I mean, she sounds concerned. She sounds more than concerned. She sounds scared. She sounds panicked. How was Nick able to create that sense of urgency for her when she's actually not seeing any of this stuff? She's not seeing someone breaking in. She's not hearing anything because presumably that's not happening.
Yeah. So, all we have is Nick's narrative. And so, imagine putting yourself in Heidi's shoes. Your husband is telling you someone's trying to break in. So she's trusting her husband's story about what's going on. And so, and he even, told investigators that they had a game plan if something were to happen like this, that, that they would rush down the stairs into the back entrance of the home leading to the garage. So, we think that, Heidi was just trusting her husband on what was going on.
And we should point out they came up with the plan because there had been a number of break-ins in the area. So they had supposedly, according to Nick, they had talked about the break-ins. Heidi had felt nervous. And so they came up with this plan as a couple.
I mean, now that I'm sort of putting myself in what could have been her position, I think about somebody waking me up out of a sleep. You know, if my husband does that and he's saying, where are the car keys? I wake up in a panic, even though it's something sort of benign. So you could see that. So Nick's 911 call was almost 7 minutes long. And Jamie, you sort of brought this up. This was brought up in the hour. But all that you're hearing in the back of that call, those are the officers coming in the door.
Right. That's not an intruder. So as we discussed, Heidi was on her phone running down the stairs, supposedly, in this very, very small space, the small foyer that has things too, like a table and other pieces of furniture and shoes that have been, there's other household items that she's having to try to get around. Supposedly at that moment, that is when Nick is struggling with this intruder and you hear nothing. The defense plays that off saying, well, she had her phone up to her head. The reason you could hear when the officers arrived and burst through the door and got to Nick Firkus is because Nick had his phone on speakerphone. So they tried to put some doubt into the minds of jurors that way to say, well, the sound would be different, but it is such a small space. I don't know how to hammer that home enough. There's not a lot of space there for one person, much less supposedly 3 people in this space where 2 of them are struggling.
And you actually, when you see the images of the scene, you don't see a lot of disruption, really. And perhaps like a really interesting part of the hour was seeing the investigators' reenactment of Nick's version of the story. Can you describe the reenactment?
Yeah, so the police went back to the house 2 days later after Heidi's shooting. It's April 2010. So they were there at 6:30. There was light out. They were saying, this just makes no sense. If you're an intruder, a burglar, do you really want to go inside a house at 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday where people will be home? The prosecutors and the investigators told us the last thing an intruder or a burglar want to do is to encounter people. Also, there's one other thing. They also tested whether you could hear this filling of the door from the upstairs. They didn't. The investigators told us they couldn't hear the doorknob being filled with from upstairs, and they checked in the bathroom as well. That's where Nick said he was to get a drink of water. So it just doesn't make sense that he would hear these noises from upstairs. The story didn't check out.
The other thing I do want to point out too, if you are someone who's coming down those stairs, there's a big kind of half moon shaped glass panel above the door. So at the heights of Heidi and Nick, if they are running down the stairs and you've supposedly heard someone at the door, you assume that their head, if he's as tall as Nick claims he is, which is more than 6 feet tall, you would think that either Heidi or Nick would take a look through that glass window to see if they saw anyone. Nick never pointed out that he saw anyone. We unfortunately don't know, if Heidi saw anyone because she was killed pretty quickly. But, there is that piece of glass there that would give you a window into what was happening outside as someone's fiddling with the door.
Right. And you would presumably go back upstairs or call 911 or do something, maybe not run towards them, but that's sort of all part of this kind of story. So hours after this alleged burglary takes place, Nick is questioned by police. And again, for our listeners, I want to describe what we see. Nick just left the hospital for treatment of his injuries because he was shot as well in this struggle, he says. So he's limping. He has crutches. An hour and 40 minutes into his discussion with investigators, he finally asks about his wife. Let's just play some of that.
Well, I just want to know the final answer on Heidi. She didn't make it. I figured that.
So in, some of the cases that I've worked on, this sort of thing kind of often stands out, that the phrasing or the questioning about whether or not a loved one has been killed is just not the way you would expect it, or the timing is odd. And as I was watching the hour, that's what I kept on thinking. Why is this not the first question out of your mouth? How is Heidi? Is Heidi okay? Is she alive?
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, Anne-Marie, because I will say that as a Minnesotan, people are very stoic, right? And so I did really question the detective. Could it have been just one of those things that this is his demeanor and this is his demeanor all the time? But I think the sticking point for everyone was the timing. If that was just his regular demeanor all the time, okay, you could kind of brush off that point of it, but it took him so long to ask about it.
I also want to mention, to Jamie's point that, when we have interviewed investigators on various stories for 48 hours, they will say that, the way people grieve in moments of shock or trauma varies. There's many ways people might process emotions or feelings. And I think, what Jamie just mentioned with that being a part of maybe the culture of Minnesota with people being stoic, that might have played a role. But then again, people process and deal with moments of trauma and shock in different ways.
I do want to add, Nick does get very emotional at the end of the interview when his family and Heidi's family come into the interrogation room. He sobs loudly, he hugs them, he's very emotional. But then the prosecutors thought that's odd as well. They were saying to us, maybe then he can turn it on and off just like that. So, I guess you can think it can go both ways.
Right. Well, the circumstances are so odd, but clearly the spidey senses for investigators were tingling.
Yeah.
Something was off. So Nick also told investigators that he and Heidi were having financial troubles, and in fact, they were behind on their mortgage payments, and they were about to get evicted. And he says something really weird about, we're moving out tomorrow. Could that have been Nick's motive for murder? But when police searched the house, nothing was packed up. There was even food in the fridge. Something was not adding up. We are going to get into some possible theories of what really happened that day after the break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. In the hour, it is clear that Nick is worried about Heidi and others finding out about his financial troubles. So first off, how did Heidi not know that they were so far behind on their mortgage payments and that they were about to be evicted? This is a woman who seems on the ball. She knows how much they both make. They should have been able to afford their bills. How did she not know?
It was brought up in the trial by the defense that there would be notices on the door at Heidi and Nick's house that they had lost their house. And how could Heidi miss these notices that were left there? Investigator Sipes believes that Nick was actually intercepting the mail. He didn't have an office job. He could go wherever he wanted during the day, while Heidi had an office job. So her theory was that Nick removed those notices from the front door.
They're a young religious couple in Minnesota who, got married very young, and she was very trusting of her husband. And her husband was supposed to take care of the finances. She went to work and he was supposed to pay the bills. She would occasionally get a call about a bill not being paid or something not happening. And she'd call him and say, hey, can you take care of this? And the one thing that stuck out to me that did not make it into the show is that Heidi Firkus went shopping at Mall of America with a friend and bought things. So if she did have an idea, you would not go with someone to Mall of America and purchase things and act like everything was fine. Her friend said she didn't make any mention of financial troubles to her. It was just, just a normal day.
And also, whether or not Heidi knew about the mortgage payments, the eviction is a point of contention in this entire story. Did Heidi know or not? And so Nick's defense team is claiming that she was fully aware and that she wasn't in the dark, but her family were not aware. Apparently, according to investigators and the prosecutors, Heidi talked to her parents regularly, and they did not know that the couple were going to be evicted the next day. So that's still sort of the $1 million question. Did Heidi know about the financial situation or not?
But still, I know money is often a motive for murder, but it's an extreme motive. I still don't really understand. I know it's embarrassing to say you're in financial trouble. I know your wife's going to get mad at you, but often in cases like that, you might see an argument that spirals out of control over money, but that wasn't the case here. What would Nick be accomplishing by killing his wife?
For us, especially working in true crime, we're always trying to figure out motives and what is the reason for it. And so life insurance policies are a big one for certain cases. In Heidi Firkus's case, there was a life insurance policy, but it was only about $30,000. It was her salary's worth, a year worth of her salary. According to investigators, Nick, who received that insurance policy as the spouse, he didn't spend that money. He returned the check, and it was given to Heidi's parents. So it kind of leaves that question. Well, then, was the life insurance policy a motive? Who knows?
It's one of those things that I remember living in Florida in 2007 as the housing crisis was, really running rampant through that state. And I remember calling home to a number of my friends in Minnesota who didn't even know what the word foreclosure meant. It's just something ingrained in the culture. You pay your bills. You go to work. They're hardworking, hardy people, and it's not as surprising to me as it was to a number of my colleagues. And I think probably not as surprising to investigators in that sense because of the culture of the state. And Nick had talked about, he had to ask his parents for help at other times. You ask your family in Minnesota one too many times for money, you start getting talked about in the family, right? So if all of a sudden he comes forward and they're getting evicted from their house, the shame of that could potentially, it wouldn't drive me to murder, but there'd be a tremendous amount of shame in that culture that you could not pay your bills.
The prosecutors also told us Nick presented himself as this person who figured the big questions in life, like how do you want your relationship with God to be? What kind of a spouse do you want to be? So his friends looked up to him. So he had this persona at church with his friends. He was very well liked, well respected. So perhaps that also played into this, how ashamed he would be from causing the financial ruin.
Asena, you spoke to his second wife, Rachel, which is like this. There's always a twist in these stories. And this is crazy twist that he goes on and falls in love and has a whole family. By the time of the interview, though, they had already gotten a divorce. But when they were still married, she started to become suspicious of Nick and decided to secretly record their conversation, which I thought was a very extreme thing to do when you're just starting to get suspicious about your spouse. Let's hear a clip from Rachel.
I found a letter saying that we hadn't paid our property taxes and that we were going to get evicted in 2020 if we didn't pay them. And when I saw that, I was like, oh no, like he was definitely repeating the same things as he did with Heidi with me.
During that time, Rachel says Nick's dishonesty started to make her question whether he had also lied about Heidi's death.
And I said, we got to sit down and talk.
Rachel secretly recorded the conversation on her phone.
Your actions have caused me to just distrust you completely.
If there was going to be a confession, I was going to make sure that I could prove that he said it.
And the fact that you're lying was so easy for you to do in front of me over and over and over makes me think
that I could murder my wife.
That you could lie about something.
That I could murder my wife.
Yes.
When I listen, I think this silence kills me. He's angry at me. How dare I think those things? Why aren't you saying you didn't? Tell me I'm not right.
It's very interesting that Nick never gives a solid answer to Rachel about the murder. So he never says, what are you talking about? I never did something like this. I didn't kill Heidi. He never denies.
How did Rachel become so suspicious of Nick? When did that start?
I think it was a process for her. I think it started with small lies. It was nothing big, but it added up. Eventually, she found a missed invoice wasn't paid for the property taxes, and they could lose their house in 2020. That was a huge red flag for her. So she then decided to get her kids, they have 3 children together, to get their kids out of the house. And she came back the next day and confronted him about what we just heard.
Jamie, were there other red flags that Rachel started to notice?
A couple of things that stuck out to me as things for Rachel seemed to unravel is that she mentioned at some point in her interview that her father-in-law, Nick's father, had one time said to her, "We don't get divorced in this family." It's another one of those situations I think goes back to them being a religious family, but it was something that stuck with her.
Jordan, you met with Rachel.
I met with Rachel for dinner. And let me tell you, it was really eye-opening. As, she was getting into a relationship with Nick, she was aware of the financial troubles that Nick had with Heidi. And so as they were getting, ready for marriage, her father-in-law warned her basically that, Nick is not good with finances. I wouldn't let him handle the finances. And she said, at that moment, she trusted her husband. He had gone through sort of a financial recovery program. So she assumed that he had a good control over the finances. And so she said she allowed him to do that. And then in the interview we did with her, she said hindsight is 2020, and she regretted that decision.
If you look at this case, and when the murder occurred was 2010, a lot of people aren't texting. You're still calling people. You're still leaving a voicemail. However, if you fast forward several years later and Rachel and Nick are in a relationship, a lot more conversations are happening by phone, including recording different conversations, even using voice memos or sending little voice texts to one another. So in some ways, I think as this case developed, the technology also changed, and some of what we now have in terms of conversations between the married couples would also evolve and change.
Fascinating. So 11 years after Heidi's death, Nick is charged with her murder. And then 2 years later, in January of 2023, he's brought to trial. What was it like being in the courtroom?
I covered the trial, and this was a very extensive trial. It was nearly 2 weeks. And the thing that stood out to me the most was the fact that it was packed on both sides. It was standing room only. And I think it really spoke to how much both of these people, Nick and Heidi, were cherished, and the feeling in the entire courtroom, because it was both families were still sort of torn and deeply fractured.
I had an opportunity to talk to some of the friends. And I think the thing that struck me in speaking to people is that Nick's friends truly believe him and believe and back him and will not be swayed, do not think the prosecution did their job, and really have faith in him that he is a good man. He would never do this. They actually are more angry, it seems, at Rachel, the second wife, and feel that she's to blame for bringing all this up. What's interesting, if you kind of peel back the onion a little bit, you have this young couple, Heidi and Nick, who get married, and, they had their friend group. Nick's very well regarded within that friend group. He's somebody that everyone's looking up to because he's one of the first to get married, and they own a home. And then when this happened, part of the prosecution's belief was that he, instead of looking like the guy who couldn't pay his bills and take care of his family, they had compassion for him. Oh my goodness, he's the man who's now lost his wife. That he would be able to turn the friend group into having empathy for him rather than him being a bad guy. And that could have played a part of the motive to investigators as they're looking at this case, instead of just the finances, the psychological part of it.
So ultimately, the jury believes the prosecution, though. Nick was found guilty on 2 counts of murder, premeditated and intentional, and given the maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. I want to listen to some of Nick's statement at sentencing.
I do maintain and will maintain to my dying breath my innocence of this crime. My body stands condemned to serve another man's sentence. But my soul remains free.
I mean, that's kind of powerful.
I was there at the sentencing, and you can feel just the dread from kind of both sides, right? Because family and friends of Heidi, they wanted justice, and it was hard to accept that someone who used to be a family member is now found, guilty of killing Heidi. And then, of course, Nick's family and friends, who never believed that Nick was the killer. And in fact, even Nick's father, who spoke at the sentencing, had asked for anyone to come forward if they know who is the actual killer. So that still spoke to the fact that many people on Nick's side thought he was innocent and still is innocent.
Wow. Jamie, Jordan, Asena, what will be your big takeaways from this case?
For me, there's a number of things I'll remember just because, as we said in the beginning, being from there, just seeing the conclusion of it, I think just sticks out to me. I think having someone like Detective Sipes have a fresh pair of eyes on the case, it was all the same evidence for 10 years. It was a detective who was determined to get the case solved one way or another. The prosecution who really enabled that detective to take a fresh look and be able to really comb through the financial records and take the time and really look at the interviews and all the different pieces. It's unusual, right? I mean, it's not something you hear about a lot. So the fact that there was a conclusion and how that conclusion came about will be the thing that sticks out to me most.
The work that the investigation poured into this case, it took over a decade. It went through the hands of 4 different investigators, even getting assisted by the FBI. I thought that was just really just interesting that they never gave up and that they kept working hard at trying to find out what happened to Heidi Firkus.
I walk away from this case thinking if you feel there's something wrong, there's probably something wrong. I think if you have a gut feeling, you should probably listen to that gut feeling. So that's what I take away from this case.
Jamie, Asena, Jordan, thank you so much for joining me for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So be sure to join us next Tuesday for another post-mortem and watch 48 Hours Saturday, 9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus. And if you're liking the show, please rate and review 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts and follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music and Wondery app or with a 48 Hours Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts.